All right, I'm going to kick us off. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you here today for today's event, Roundtable on Preparing U.S. Clinical Trials Infrastructure for Times of Emergency. My name is Lizzie Reagan, and I'm joining you today on behalf of the White House Office of Science and Tech Policy. I'm going to make a couple of quick remarks before we get started. The first is a little bit of the impetus behind today's event. The COVID-19 pandemic stress tested our national clinical trials infrastructure in an unprecedented way. We saw examples of tremendous private-public partnerships, and we also saw the ramifications of fragmented, poorly designed studies that failed to generate actionable results for patients in need. In order to truly transform U.S. capabilities to prevent and respond effectively to future pandemics, we can and we must do better. As called for in the recently updated National Biodefense Strategy and the American Pandemic Preparedness Plan, we need a coordinated and agile clinical trials infrastructure that can be called upon to rapidly ramp up in times of need. If you can advance to the next slide. Back one slide. All right, well, today's event, thank you. Today's event is in part of OSTP's outreach and engagement strategy to gain insights on how do we achieve this goal. Right now, we have an active request for information on this topic for which we're accepting responses through January 27th. You may choose to respond to the entire breadth of the RFI or choose a single or a handful of components to respond to. Submissions can be attached to an email up to 8 pages in length and can also be submitted as email. We welcome your unique perspective on ideas on how to advance this important issue. And I'm going to have my colleagues put the link to the RFI in the chat. Next slide, please. Just a few quick items of business before we kick it off. First, an overview of how today's event is going to go. Our panel is going to be broken into 2 different parts, split up by 2 intersessions, 10 minutes in length, for which we're going to field Q&A from the audience. Please use the chat function to put in comments and questions as we go. We'll be monitoring that in real time. Today's event will wrap up at 2:30 p.m. Eastern. Next slide, please. Today's event is being recorded, and that recording will be made available to the public following the conclusion. Your participation today implies consent to be a part of the record. We are committed to providing a harassment-free event for all, and will remove any participant who does not comply with its standards. As I mentioned throughout the event, please use the chat function to engage with comments or questions. I will be monitoring it along with my colleagues. If you have any logistical questions or concerns as the event goes on, please either use the chat or you can email my colleague Lori, who will support in real time. We'll put her email address in the chat as well. Yes, please. All right, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome and introduce today's esteemed panel. All registrants of today's event should have received detailed bios ahead of time, so we're going to keep this brief. Really my pleasure, our pleasure to welcome Dr. Stacey Adam, Associate Vice President for the Foundations for the NIH, Dr. Brian Anderson, Chief Digital Health Physician from MITRE Health, Dr. Lindsay Baden, Vice President of Clinical Research at Brigham and Women's Hospital, Dr. Rob Califf, Commissioner for the FDA, Dr. Lisa Fitzpatrick, Founder and CEO of Grapevine Health, Esther Krofa, Executive Vice President for Faster Cures at the Milken Institute, Professor Sir Martin Landry, Professor of Medicine and Epidemiology at the University of Oxford, Dr. Cliff Lane, Deputy Director for NIAID, Vicki Leamy, Vice President for Therapeutic Science and Strategy for IQVIA, Dr. Shalini Mohan, Executive Director and Head of Health Equity and Inclusive Research at Genentech, and Ramita Tandon, Chief Clinical Trials Officer at Walgreens. And with that, Grail, I pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Lizzie, for that intro, and huge thanks, first of all, to all of our incredible panelists and to everyone else who has joined us today. We're very, very excited to be here. I'd like to start by saying a quick word about everything that has led up to this point. At the Office of Science and Technology Policy, we've been looking at a number of issues related to clinical trials for some time, including trying to prepare our infrastructure to respond better and in a more coordinated way in cases of emergency. You know, as Lizzie described at the top, at the beginning of the COVID outbreak, we saw a very fragmented research response in this country, where we had a number of trials sort of being carried out separately in different places that sometimes were too small to generate actionable data. This created a problem. Obviously, as time moved on, tremendous things were accomplished, but we did lose time with that early fragmentation. So we've actually issued 2 RFIs. The one that Lizzie was describing, which is the main sort of subject of today's session. We also issued a separate RFI in parallel, which is more specifically focused on data capture, and we had a terrific session on that yesterday. But the RFI that is most associated with this event covers a whole range of issues. If you've looked at it, you're familiar with the topics, but if not, just to skate over them very quickly, it covers a range of issues from, should there be a U.S. level coordinating or governance function? If so, what should that look like? How do we build a more diverse and comprehensive network of sites in this country? As everybody knows, diversity is a major problem in this space, and we need a more diverse pool of participants as well as a more diverse group of investigators. How do we develop a warm base of clinical research? How do we coordinate internationally? And a variety of other things. So we're going to touch on a number of these things today as we move through. And in the first half hour of discussion today, I'd like to start with some questions about governance and then turn to some questions about protocol design and how we get into communities and make our studies more diverse. So turning to our panel, to get started, if we think about some kind of federal level governance structure or coordinating body, that would draw on the expertise of, the various agencies that have equities in this space, including FDA, NIH, DOD, others. What would be, let's talk first about what could be some of the key functions of that governance structure. This could include things like developing protocols in concert with stakeholders, determining when emergency trials should begin, other things like that. Would love to hear your thoughts on that, and in particular, whether there are certain functions that are sort of standing functions, activities that you might want to be ongoing before any particular emergency, versus others that are more situation dependent and that might not only be, sort of able to be activated or properly thought through when the emergency actually arises. Because we definitely have seen in looking at this issue that we can't think just about emergencies as a separate category of situation, because getting ready for them in the between times is going to be very important to being ready to respond when an emergency actually strikes. So with that, why don't we turn to the panel? Let me see there. Who would like to respond on this question? I'm sorry, I'm having trouble seeing people's hands. There we go. Rob, thanks so much. Please chime in.
Hey, I'm always have opinions, as you know. First of all, I just can't emphasize enough my belief that any notion that we can have an entirely separate response to emergencies versus having standing capability, I think is just flat out wrong. You want to express that in the strongest possible terms. If there are other opinions, of course, it's possible I could be wrong, but I believe that very strongly. Also, just as a construct, I mean, to me, there's a place for, in terms of governance, there's a place for what I would call discovery trials, which are sort of in the classic NIH mode. There's a very large place for so-called regulatory trials, which are companies trying to get products on the market. But in my view, what we don't have is a governance structure that identifies the most important questions for public health and make sure that those questions get answered. And I would love to see something like that, because I think those are the trials that get the least attention. They sort of fall between the cracks. Now, how such a governance board should be created, I'll stop there and see if people agree or disagree or have other suggestions.
Stacey, please chime in.
Yeah, I think just to build on what Rob just said, you know, I agree that the trials have to be looked at slightly differently, but I do think that there could be an ability to have a standing committee that actually works across sectors. One of the things that obviously we witnessed in this current pandemic was there was a lot of conflicting, I guess, efforts at the site and you know, organizational level when it came to hospitals really implementing trials. And, you know, part of that was disparate starting times for the different efforts that were coming through, whether it be academic trials, company trials, the government sponsored trials. If we had a common standing cross-sector, meaning, you know, public, private, academic committee that could sort of help to coordinate the response and do exactly what Rob just articulated, which is to identify the most important trials and the order in which they should be conducted, and really have buy-in from sites that they will adhere to that idea that we are trying to move in the best interest of public health. And, you know, by having cross-sector, having industry members, having government members sit on this committee, everybody gets a chance to be represented. That way we're not defaulting to company trials to get drugs approved. We're not defaulting to the trials that the government wants to see run. I think it can be a dialogue, really. As far as who gets to decide when it starts, I think that might lie more strictly with government. I hope they have the most information, but I don't know that that's true. I'm willing to be wrong on that one.
Okay, let's hold that for 1 second in terms of who decides when emergency research should start. So Stacey, are you seeing that as sort of like a standing function that might, identifying these research questions might be sort of usefully looked at before an outbreak is actually spreading? Is that sort of how you're seeing this?
I mean, I think you can form something that's standing to the extent that, like, you're not going to meet every month, every week, that sort of thing. But we've already, and the NIH I know has gone to great lengths to sort of identify what they consider to be top emerging pathogens. You could have whatever is the right cadence, biannual, that sort of thing, have this committee meet, review that, and review what would be needed if we started, you know, if another SARS came through, or maybe it'll be bacterial next time, what would be needed to make sure that we had a coordinated effort. I think it's more about the relationship building and the trust to be built amongst these groups, that the people who are representing each sector are going to make the unified decision on behalf of public health rather than in the best interest of their sector.
Got it. Martin, please go ahead.
Yes, thanks very much. I mean, I'm obviously commenting from outside, as it were, but on the basis of experience of running the recovery trial and among other things. I think the first thing to pick up on is Dr. Caleb's point that we can't invent a system just because there's a pandemic and expect it to work. You can't just flick a switch and assume that the electricity supply is going to work well. You've got to be running this running something all the time. But I put that around the infrastructure, perhaps more so than the governance. Governance for coordination maybe, but for decision making in some people call it sort of peacetime, if you like, then I think the role is very different. I think that, and that infrastructure, we might come on to this in a minute, what do we actually mean by infrastructure? That's not just technology, which obviously dealt with in data yesterday. It's also around policy, it's around funding decisions, it's around training, it's around engagement and a number of other things. I think when the switch does you do want to flick the switch, then there is a role for prioritization. Number one is who was funding all those small studies and why were they wasting their money? And why were they wasting the physician's time and the patient's time and contribution? So the first thing is, what can we stop doing? The second thing is then, well, how does the prioritization work? Now, coming from a small country east of here, you know, the US is a huge place. You know, one of your states, even one of your healthcare systems, healthcare providers often has more patients than large chunks of the UK. So you don't have to have everywhere, you just have to have enough. But also, I think, particularly when one comes to governance, the question is to see what the role of that governance is. We shouldn't start, I'm worried that the first recommendation for this whole session is create a committee. Create a committee is not a good way to make progress. But in this context, you need prioritization, support, and coordination so that the good trials have the backing and get through. But then you also need to create a freedom to innovate and operate. And from running the recovery trial, when it worked at its best, it was exactly that mix. It was a combination of government, health system, regulatory and other support, enablement, if you like, prioritization, turning around protocol amendments in sometimes 4 hours. It was that level of support, but then giving Peter Horby and myself and our team the freedom to work out how we were actually going to deliver. And keeping that separation is important. Big organizations, big committees, big coordination structures don't ever do anything in a nimble and agile fashion. And I think one needs to differentiate those two pieces.
Noted. Good point. Esther, please go ahead.
Yes, so I agree with many of the points raised, though I do think that there is an appropriate governance coordinating function that needs to occur. What we saw during COVID is that there was a lack of understanding, especially here in the US, where clinical trial infrastructure lies. And so when we looked across the US, we saw that there are large academic research institutions that were able to very quickly stand up COVID-19 trials. But when we matched that against where we saw patients who had the disease over a portion of time, we had a mismatch. We did not have patients located where these academic sites were conducting these trials. And in fact, we saw that the academic trials started to compete for patients, but if you went to the middle of the country, if you went to the rural part of the country, all of those places did not have appropriate clinical trial infrastructure. So I would envision part of a coordinating structure or governance structure would be to identify what is our clinical trial capacity as a country, where are those gaps, how do we fill those gaps? Could that coordinating function serve as a technical assistance function where you're able to very quickly deploy the resources, the technical assistance that's necessary, both in the infrastructure, as you talked about, Martin, but also in the resources that are going to be necessary to train the workforce that's appropriate, to get the clinicians up to speed in the appropriate protocols, alignment of endpoints, alignment of guidelines and criteria, et cetera. But I do think that's a critical function. The second function would be around securing ongoing funding for those big public health needs, because the way our system is organized right now, it's really sponsor-driven trials or academic-driven trials that, as Rob mentioned, are not really oriented toward public health needs. However, we need funding to address public health needs, and that could certainly be a function of the coordinating entity.
Great points. Okay, Lindsay, then Brian, and then I want to turn to another question real quick. Lindsay, please go ahead.
Yes, no, just want to, since we're talking about governance, there are many more topics that we will cover, and building on what others have said, which is very important. I think key concepts, the tempo of the outbreak matters, how it's funded will matter, and then what are we trying to achieve? We may not know the biology of the process, so I don't want us to abrogate the hypothesis generation, the pathophysiologic determination that may come from smaller studies or from individual or small collectives versus the registration trials that are trying to develop a new product and bring it forward as rapidly as possible. So we need to have flexibility in what type of governance we have to make sure we're enabling both the small innovative as well as the larger, perhaps confirmatory or treatment affirming studies. And the governance will have to be able to reflect that flexibility in reflection to the tempo of the problem.
Yep, absolutely. So one focus here would be to have some kind of potential look at what protocols are important. Brian, please go ahead.
I think just building off of what Esther and Lindsay just said, part of the challenge that I saw in the COVID pandemic is the way that trials are conducted traditionally now is what I would articulate as a somewhat inflexible way. And the natural history of any pandemic, of any emerging disease, is going to require the kinds of flexibility that Lindsay and Esther are describing, the kinds of mismatch that we saw geographically across the country, when you stand up a network of academic medical centers that are easily able to activate themselves for a trial, and then you have the pandemic move to a new geographic region, perhaps it's in the middle of the country where there are not those academic institutions to enroll those patients, that created real challenges. And so the kind of governance structure that supports that kind of flexibility and coordination, as well as the ability to agree upon and prioritize trials across institutions, I think is really important. We saw a lot of institutions competing for patients internally and amongst themselves. And so I think having the kind of federal support to coordinate that and to prioritize both geographically and within institutions will be really important.
I agree. Those are great points. Lisa, do you want to jump in here? I see your hand.
Sure. Yeah. In thinking about the governance and the infrastructure question you raised, I want to advocate for more community integration and involvement, because someone's already mentioned trust. We were on the ground a lot during the pandemic, talking to people about vaccinations, and we recognize people don't understand clinical trials. They didn't understand clinical trials before there was a pandemic. And asking people to understand that amidst a national or global emergency created an impossible situation. So I think part of the conversation on the governance committee, or in these discussions, where are the community voices? Who could be represented at the table to bring these issues around trust, around health education, around what sort of infrastructure is needed on the ground to ensure clinical trials are available, as someone said, not just in academic institutions, but in community. And there are plenty of organizations, not just federally qualified health centers, but social service-based organizations that would be willing to participate in this process ahead of time so that we're prepared. I think one of our biggest challenges was that not only did people not understand the clinical trial process, but when the time came, no one really understood what to do. And people also didn't know who to call. So if we start thinking about this from the beginning and making sure the community voices are at the table, we won't continue to see communities left behind.
Yeah, absolutely. These are all great comments, and Esther and Lisa and Brian, you brought up some points that kind of lead us to the next thing I want to discuss in this session, which is how to structure our community engagement and our protocols to reach a broader population, getting both to the mismatch, that Esther described so eloquently, and just to the question of diversity. Eager to hear people's thoughts on any angle of this, but one piece of this is to what extent we can integrate into medical practice or community care mechanisms that will allow us to gather data in an emergency, whether it's basic data or data for a more complex study. Shalini, I see your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Grail. I want to call back to a comment that Dr. Califf made at the beginning, that we need to have some infrastructure or ideology in place in the non-pandemic or non-emergent setting. I think that the FDA guidance for industry on diversity in clinical trials is definitely a step in that direction, because it provides at least a common language for everyone to be speaking in a shared objective. And then along the lines of the other comments that were made regarding the need for building community engagement and trust, we need to be doing this on a regular basis. And we have some examples where at Genentech, we've established an Advancing Inclusive Research Site Alliance. So basically some sites that will reach more underserved populations and communities to be able to engage their voice, and that we can leverage whenever there are clinical trials that need to be conducted, so that we have representation appropriately of the underserved or underrepresented populations more consistently. During the COVID pandemic, there was also disproportionate disease burden on many of the patient populations that were alluded to in the last topic area. And I would like to just challenge our thinking that the clinical trial data is more robust when it comes from academic institutions. Our experience, especially with the Impactus study during COVID-19, was that by engaging community-based clinical trial sites, we were not only able to reach over 84% representation of historically underrepresented populations, but that we were able to execute that trial much more quickly than average clinical trials, not just because of the pandemic, but because we were not competing for patients, because there were untapped, basically, institutions that were available to conduct high quality clinical research. So this is something that we are also seeking to do more of in the future, is to engage those community-based sites as we move forward. As there are also other populations that may not have access to some of the institutions where clinical trials are typically conducted. For example, the American Indian Alaska Native population very rarely has access to our what we call academic institutions, and Indian Health Services during the pandemic also, I think, struggled with being able to provide access for their patient populations to innovative medicines, where clinical trials at the time and the beginning of the pandemic were the primary source of some of these innovative therapies that could have been life-saving. So,
yeah, absolutely. There's a real access issue there. We saw that. We've seen that expressed in the comments as well. Ramita, please go ahead.
Yeah, if I can just build on some earlier comments that were made around, just having that coordination infrastructure ready. If I think about, from a retail pharmacy perspective, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the retail pharmacies rose to the challenge to respond to the crisis. Over 270 million vaccinations were administered across the nation. And, we quickly learned that it was not a one-size-fits-all strategy as we started to get into the communities. I mean, it really required a lot of grassroots efforts, community activation, engagement, and ultimately empowering, patients and consumers to make the right decisions to get vaccinated. And so, as I think about the learnings that we had, we certainly had to train and leverage our pharmacists, our pharmacy care teams to be able to work with the consumers and patients and get them prepared so that they felt comfortable. So as we think about here at Walgreens, we've lived through a tremendous amount of activity during the crisis. We've launched a clinical trial business, which ultimately is to create the highway into patient communities that have never had access to clinical research. I mean, we all know that we've been leveraging the same, AMCs or hospital systems or patient populations, but there's the swath of the nation that have never participated in clinical trials. And our goal is to be able to bring research closer into these patient communities, but it's going to take work. And so, we're making the efforts to use our pharmacy infrastructure, our pharmacy care teams, and start to educate and empower our patient communities to understand what a clinical trial is, because that is real world medicine for us, for our consumers and patients. The lion's share do not understand what a clinical trial is. And those that do perhaps might have some mistrust in the healthcare ecosystem or perhaps with the industry. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done at the community level to raise the bar so people feel comfortable as we try to bring those patients into research.
Absolutely. And so, part of this is just thinking differently about where the infrastructure is, because we've got to find it in new places. And also the kind of comfort level that you're talking about, I'm sure would help with, consenting and recruitment when the time comes. Brian, please go ahead. You were next.
Thanks, Grail. Really just want to build on a comment that Shalini had mentioned. So during the pandemic, I did a fair bit of work with Native American reservations in the tribal communities. And one of the things that I really come to appreciate being here in the center of Boston, which is very different than rural tribal communities on reservations, is the value of supporting pragmatic clinical trials and trials that can easily be enabled by frontline clinicians that aren't, traditionally the kinds of researchers that are incentivized and supported to do complex protocols from academic institutions. How can we support those IHS clinicians that Shalini mentioned, or how can we enable the trusted names and trusted places like your local pharmacy at Walgreens or CVS to identify and enroll patients that are traditionally not part of these clinical trials? I do believe that pragmatic trials are at least part of the answer, and having the kinds of common data models that are easily deployed and can be used for two reasons, right? One, for standard of care, but also for trials, to be able to get to the ascertainment level that's needed. I think having those kinds of common data models embedded in pragmatic trials that can be leveraged in those kinds of communities is part of the answer.
I agree, and well said. Esther, please go ahead.
Yes, I just want to build on some of the points that have been made. So I think we all agree, and I think I even mentioned the fact that we need to make sure that these trials are in community settings, but I just want to underscore how much resources all of this is going to take. Oftentimes, I see initiatives where we are funding a 2-year pilot or a 3-year pilot, but these developing these new infrastructure is going to take commitment over a long period of time. We're talking about workforce development. We're talking about systems that are already overburdened with patient care, who do not have the resources to put aside providers or clinicians to execute research studies. So we need to create that workforce. We need to align IRB processes. We need to work on contracting, on data interoperability. I mean, there's a mountain of issues that need to be worked through. So we think one set of opportunity is really to build on some of these existing networks that already are in community-based settings. When we look across where we have federal investment, there are a number of these networks that in fact were pivoted for COVID-19 research studies, but we need to maintain the ongoing engagement of those networks into routine care and how they're responding to other public health issues as well. The other question, of course, then is how do we capture the totality of these sets of activities so we're directing the appropriate resources in the right places? And I don't think we have that visibility today, but the opportunities could be the use of technology. For example, we do not have a common platform to understand how patients can participate in research across the country, and clinicaltrial.gov does not provide a patient-facing or participant-facing interface in such a way that makes it easy to engage. We need to think about how we need to do that differently. And then finally, this issue of community trust is really around that earlier question of this ongoing engagement. If we come in and we do this high-level research and swoop away after one research study and say, trust us for next time, that is not going to occur. And in fact, we're going to go back on the trust that we've really started to work on during the last few years. So I would just encourage all of us to think about this as an ongoing long-term financial investment that are going to pay dividends, but only if we see it through.
Completely agree. Okay, we just have a few minutes left, and we've got 4 commenters, so I'm going to call on you guys, and hopefully we can wrap it up in a few minutes. Martin, please.
Yeah, sure. I'm just sort of reflecting. We're going to pick up in a minute, but on design. I mean, there wasn't a problem with getting a large number of small trials up and running in the United States. There were nearly 3,000 of them. The problem was that they were designed in such a way that many of them that they weren't either going to succeed because they were impractical, or they weren't going to answer a question even if they were concluded. So there's a fundamental problem of design which we need to address. The second thing is, so far we've invented a committee and the requirement for funds, and whilst both may well be true, I think what we actually should be doing is reversing this. How easy can we make it to do clinical trials? For the patients, for the clinicians, and for the system. And when I say clinicians, it could be pharmacists, it can be nurses, it can be ambulance service, it can be doctors in hospital, out of hospital, whatever. What is so special about a clinical trial that it requires special training at the front line? Essentially, if you take hydroxychloroquine, thousands of doctors prescribed it to hundreds of thousands, if not millions, and millions of patients all around the world, without any additional training. All you needed to do was insert the toss of a coin, randomization, and see what happens to people. And you would have saved millions of dollars, and you would have saved huge amounts of other resource and time wastage and focus on other things. So we have to build on what's there, whether it's, where do we go for patients? You go where the patients are. If you want patients of a particular description, you go where those sort of people go. If you want them at a particular stage of disease, you go where they are in that journey. And then we have to be on top of all that. It's about engagement, it's about transparency and honesty. Honesty that we don't know the answers, and transparency about what we're doing. I see no reason why protocols should not be public documents across the board, but most particularly in a pandemic. And I see really very little reason as to why study progress shouldn't be public knowledge. And I see no reason at all why the results shouldn't be made available as rapidly as possible. So let's go from trials are hard to trials are easy. What's stopping them being easy?
Yeah, great thoughts about design and sort of going where people are. Vicki and Lindsay, let me get to you real quickly before we go to the break here or to the next session.
Yeah, and Martin actually started a lot of what I wanted to say here, but a lot of what we observed through COVID, we had an opportunity to see quite a few different trial designs. There were a couple of things that made things challenging and not simple for us to operationalize. One, the study designs were often complex, a lot of secondary endpoints. I don't think we had consensus in terms of what the study design should be, and there was not obvious looped feedback as to how that should evolve over time. And that resulted in an awful lot of protocol amendments, more protocol amendments through the pandemic than what we would necessarily see through regular research. So getting to a simplicity and making sure we're collecting the right data at the right time is very, very important. And I see that as a key function of what a governance structure would do. And then the other piece that I think a governance structure should also consider is transportability of knowledge and talent across borders, because we had talent sitting in pockets, and this goes back to some of the points that Esther was making and Shalini was making, that we know where the subjects are, where the community is. We have people that are trained maybe in different locations. Bringing that talent to the community just in time is something that I think we need to find a way to deal with. And that may be about licensure across borders. It may be about having a professional licensure in terms of study coordinator staff, et cetera. But there is a function there where we could do more of a hive approach as an industry. And I think we need to capitalize on that. Thank you.
Great, Lindsay, quickly.
Yes, 4 quick points. One is building on what's been said, we need to normalize the concept that advancing knowledge is part of care, so that being in a study is not exceptional, but more routine. Number 2, new molecular entities are different in my mind than repurposed drugs, where we have an understanding of their behavior, not necessarily for the disease and interest, but of their behavior. This then gets to the issue of the proportionality of risk. Cytokine manipulation may belong in a different setting than a drug that has been given to tens of millions of people for another condition. And lastly, we assume we know at the endpoint. And as just stated, we did not know the endpoint 3 years ago. We made it up. And we had to refine it as technology advanced to allow us to have molecular endpoints. So we have to think a bit that we may not know what we want the endpoint to be early on in the pandemic because our knowledge is limited. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Fantastic discussion. It's time to turn to some of the Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Grail. So there's been, thank you everyone for contributing to the chat. There's a ton of really important themes there. One that I want to pull out in particular is bringing clinical trials to the patient. That in times of emergency, it is in many ways a privilege to be adjacent to and have access to an academic medical center. And I want to put out to our panelists now, thinking about decentralization, what are both methodologic as well as technologic innovations that you in your sector deployed to help achieve that, to help bring clinical research to the patient? Stacey, I'll let you kick it off.
Yeah, and this was a bit what I was going to weigh into on the last conversation. So we in Active, I think I'd like to put forward, Active 6 basically put forward that there's no reason why we cannot run a decentralized trial in the United States. Granted, building on Lindsay's comment, it depends on the drugs that you're studying and what we know about them already. And clearly, you're not going to take new molecular entities and necessarily take them through a decentralized trial right away. But I don't think there's any reason for the repurposed agents that we cannot do this. We had clinical trial sites set up in maybe 25 of the states. We enrolled from all 50 states through a call center. 50% or better of our enrollment was through call center. all the follow-up was done via, you know, an app either on your phone or on the computer. Everything was gathered remotely. The drugs were sent remotely. The tests were uploaded remotely. There was no reason a person had to see a physician if they didn't want to. Now, again, if people wanted to go into the sites, we did, for where they had sites available, had that opportunity. They also had the ability for video consultation. So to your question, Lizzie, you know, making sure that we're using the technology that obviously we made popular during the pandemic. There's telehealth and telemedicine and video medicine should become a more standard part of trials. There's no reason to bring a patient into a site if they don't need to come in, if you don't need to have blood work done. We also, through some of the outpatient trials, piloted remote collection of samples, remote collection, and that was not only like testing samples like nose swabs. We deployed kits for remote blood collection, you know, the arm places where you just place the device on your arm and it collects a little bit of blood for like testing and monitoring. I think we need to promote those and work on getting those more standardized and validated with our regulatory colleagues, that they'll allow them to be deployed on a more regular basis. So again, I think decentralized trials are absolutely possible. Are they the right fit for everything that we're going to be studying? Probably not. We're still going to have to do the disease pathobiology studies, as people have noted, but I do think that there is a strong place for them to play in the next response.
Yeah, great point, Stacey. And I think what I love about this is, you know, thinking about worm-based research and how do we advance and de-risk technology in quote unquote the quiet times. That this isn't, we can't be figuring out how to deploy innovation in times of emergency. We have to be integrating it into our day-to-day, our normal clinical trials as part of this infrastructure. All right, Shalini, passing it to you.
Thanks, Lizzie. I wanted to agree with the point that Stacey made regarding decentralization and all of the tools that we now have in our toolkit following the pandemic. I think we really learned that there's a lot that can be done without a patient actually having to come into a healthcare center. I think that also we have a great opportunity to challenge ourselves to reduce the amount of assessments that we have in study protocols, to streamline those. That will both decrease burden on the patients as well as sites. And so as we look to reach more patient communities, build trust by really demonstrating that the data that's collected is going to inform patient care directly, and those endpoints, as well as in addition to decentralization, I think probably a future model in general clinical trials in that quiet time will be hybrid. So again, that will help reduce some of the burden on institutions and patients. And we have a lot of novel sites of care now, with many pharmacies offering urgent care services where some clinical trial assessments could be performed that might be in a patient community. And I think a great example, not in relation to clinical trials, but is the Test to Treat initiative, where that's really streamlining a process for patients to be able to go and get tested and treated at once. So they're avoiding secondary or tertiary level care, reducing burden on the system for emergency care services potentially, and then also having to take less time off to make those appointments possible. Thank you.
Great point. Lisa, I'm going to let you have last word, and then we're going to go back to part 2 of the panel.
Okay, just a couple of additional comments. I really want to double down on the need to prepare the community for this. People are not ready because this is a foreign concept to them about going into clinical trials. And a lot of times you ask people, if you use the word study, you use the word research, it's taboo, people are afraid. And so I just think we can't wave a magic wand and expect this to happen, expect the community to be ready. So let's say we were in a perfect state and decentralized trials happen. Are people ready? Will they come? We saw that during the pandemic. So let's learn from that experience. And then the second thing is there has to be accountability for facilitating access to trials in the community, because there's a lot of talk about it, but there are also a lot of barriers and a lot of pushback. People saying, you know, giving you a list of reasons why it's not feasible. So if the accountability is built in from the beginning, I think that's really important. Otherwise, this probably will not be realized.
Absolutely, fantastic point. Ramita, last word from you, and then we'll get back to girls' questions.
Yeah, just a final comment, you know, on Lisa's point. I mean, we see this. I mean, obviously, we've got 9,000 stores across the U.S. We're servicing about 150 million lives that come through our stores and pharmacies every day. And I would wholeheartedly agree is that we've got tremendous hesitancy or lack of understanding of what is an actual clinical trial. So, from our perspective, we're taking our learnings from the COVID-19 pandemic. We're activating our locations where we're training clinical pharmacists who've been educated, skilled, to be able to work with their patients that they serve to help them understand what a clinical trial is. Now, I think we have to keep in mind, at least, real world medicine, I call it, we've got patients and consumers that don't have the same medical literacy, digital literacy, and let's face it, the technology and the broadband is not consistent across this nation. So as we think about deploying solutions, we have to be relevant, culturally relevant what's happening into these communities. So again, trying to build the right highway into these communities and making sure that we're bringing trials into the communities is something we have to think about.
Great, thank you so much. And I'd like to kind of continue some of the threads that Lisa and Ramita, you and Shalini, you were just raising, and talk about what are some of the effective ways, being more specific, that we can get into communities and prepare ourselves to have a warm base of clinical research or sites that could at least participate in certain kinds of clinical research, understanding there's a range. You might have at one end of the spectrum a simpler, more pragmatic, data-focused study. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got regulatory intent trials with investigational agents. Not all places or situations might be able to support, all of those. But with that in mind, how do we increase the number of sites and communities that are capable and interested in doing that, and to make it fit into the work that they already need to do in their communities? What's needed in terms of education and in terms of continuity, as Esther was pointing out, sort of being in the community and not just parachuting in when you need something. Thoughts on that? Ramita, do you have more to say on that? Or?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump in a little bit just to kind of, like I said earlier, we're activating our locations to do some of the more low complex types of services. So we're doing screening, diagnostic, and phlebotomy services, right? So we recognize that we can't take on complex trials, but this is where we'll partner with healthcare systems where, a patient can go into their healthcare system to get more complicated visits, completed, and then come into a Walgreens or a retail pharmacy to get more follow-up or low complex follow-up visits completed. So that way you retain the patient, you start to enable better access, and don't make it burdensome for patients to participate. So we're starting to see that develop, and we're creating those relationships with our healthcare systems to be able to, provide a better workflow for patients to participate. So we're leveraging our physical footprint in ways to make trials accessible for our patients and our communities today.
Esther, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I want to underscore, I think the retail model is an interesting emerging model that we need to pay close attention to. It's an opportunity for us to rapidly and quickly scale to appropriate type of trials, for sure, but they have a reach into the community and are a known entity to the community in a way that might solve for some of the challenges that we've been talking about. And at the same time, what we saw during COVID is that a number of collaborations and partnerships came to be. For example, I was recently in Memphis, Tennessee, and the public health department partnered with churches and local organizations and other community health centers to increase awareness around their clinical trials and increase awareness around the vaccine uptake and so forth. And they had funding in order to do that and maintain those sets of activities. And most of them now are getting disbanded without that ongoing sources of funding, leveraging the community hospital, public health authorities to identify in their own local communities where should that capacity be built and who is most poised in order to be deployed as a potential clinical trial site might be a really important investigation evaluation that we ought to do. And then thirdly, of course, there's a saying, don't do it for us without us, right? So we need to make sure that as we're going into communities, we are asking important questions. Are we setting up sites that are responding to questions that matter to the community? Are we destigmatizing clinical research and the terminology so that's even acceptable? Much more beyond just establishing a site. You can build it and no one will come because we have not done that groundwork.
Yeah. And let's also keep in mind sort of like varying degrees of digital literacy, something that was mentioned, I think, previously, and we talked about this a lot yesterday too in the session on data capture as we move towards greater innovation in various decentralized trial techniques. How do we make that sort of available as we move forward? Brian, please go ahead.
Yeah, Esther brought up, one saying. The other one that I really like is trusted names and trusted places. And, during Operation Warp Speed, the work that we did with the federal government oftentimes involved public-private partnerships. And one of the things that we didn't appreciate at the beginning, but I certainly came to appreciate towards the end, is the value of it being not just a public-private partnership, but a public-private community partnership. And the importance of engaging those local community members that are trusted members of the community, be it a frontline clinician, again, as I said, a pharmacist, or an individual clinician who doesn't traditionally conduct research. Those are the clinicians that are going to be the trusted members to engage the more diverse segments of the population that we want to be part of these trials. And I will echo another thing Esther said, which is I am now seeing those non-traditional partnerships that were so beautiful and wonderful things during the pandemic now be defunded or not prioritized moving forward. And I think those are the kinds of partnerships that we need to invest in this warm period of a clinical trial infrastructure moving forward.
Absolutely. Lindsay, please go ahead.
Yes, and I want to bring back into front and center view Martin's point earlier. We need to simplify the clinical trials process. As Martin said before, and as he's shown us in what was able to be done in the UK. So we have to lower the activation energy to what does it take to launch a clinical trial. That from a regulatory standpoint, an e-consent standpoint, a technology for data collection, a mail for the study product, or for receipt of sample. So we need to think long and hard about how do we lower the activation energy so all communities can have access, because you don't need a physical structure like an academic center. We need to build the capacity, which is workforce and a culture in our trusted community centers, be they pharmacies, houses of worship, local health centers. We need to lower the activation energy for the research and then build an understanding of the importance of research in trusted community centers across the spectrum of services to the community. I think it's possible. I think we've seen examples of it, but we need to think about how do we institutionalize this so the activation energy is much lower.
Yeah, great points. And speaking of activation energy, in terms of just the thought to keep in mind as we go forward, in terms of recruitment and enrollment, does it make sense to wait to do that until you've got the trial that you want to do, or do you want to kind of like engage and consent a population before that and then try to get them involved once you have a protocol in a specific effort? Stacey, please go ahead.
Just a note on that last point that you just made. I mean, that was sort of the strategy that the new Recover effort that's being overseen by NIH is taking. They began with observational studies and enrolling people and cataloging symptoms with the hope that they could then translate those patients into interventional trials later on. And so I think there's probably some merit to just articulating what you just said. But I just wanted to build on one point that both Brian and Esther had brought up about these public-private partnerships that had been formed. We agree they were invaluable in everything they got done in kind of the big efforts within this pandemic. I guess I would note, I've been watching sort of the news coming out. There are efforts both in the public and the private sector to begin this workforce building. Novartis has contributed funds, I think Morehouse, there's a number of these things. These are just ones that are like popping to my mind right now. But I wonder if there isn't some sort of merit into trying to better connect and coordinate those efforts to make sure that we're all sort of leveraging each other's resources to the best possible. And I guess that goes back to just at the start, the reason, not so much Martin, that I know we need another committee, but more, the committee is more just for talking and the trust building and making sure all of these groups are still remaining in contact with each other, and we're making sure we've got the information exchange that we need, because I think that's the biggest problem. We forget that we need to be talking to everyone and continuing, again, across the board trust, you know, that sort of thing. And I think we only do that by continuing the conversation.
Thank you. Very good points. Lisa, please go ahead.
Thank you. My comment is about a previous comment about the disconnect between where research funding is going and where clinical trial funding is going, and where the trust has been built in order to diversify clinical trials, educate people, and get folks signed up and comfortable with trials. And so a lot of these conversations, or a lot of these comments we're making today, I know are not new comments for government funders. And I know partially because I've offered a lot of these comments to funders. And so I just want to register that I'm inviting NIH and other clinical trial funders to really assess what are the barriers to adopting a lot of these recommendations and embracing these observations and experiences we've had about what it's actually going to take to diversify clinical trials and continue to make efforts to get underserved communities, Black and Brown people in these trials and comfortable with these trials. I think we have a lot of information. There's been a lot of data collected, but the system isn't moving. And so I'm just pressing a little bit for those people who are holding the purse to really ask intentionally and in a focused way and say, what can we do to move beyond where we are now, making sure the money is actually going to the places where communities trust and listen.
Thank you, and well said. Martin, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to build on this concept of trust and actually really being trustworthy. I mean, I think that's an important differentiator. Trust me is there are many people who will say trust me. It's actually whether I'm worth your trust. And for that, one needs some competence, some honesty, and some reliability to deliver. And I think the concept of trials being done to people as opposed to being done with and for people is an important differentiator likewise. But I wanted to really come to the point of all this. The point of doing trials, remember I'm a clinical trialist of several decades. The point of doing clinical trials is not to do clinical trials. The point of doing clinical trials is to do better health. And in doing better health, we have to know, we have to have reliable information for whatever decision we need to make. The decision that the FDA have to make is a different set of decisions from the decisions that payers have to make, or clinicians, or guideline writers, or public health bodies, or patients themselves. But the point of doing trials is to generate evidence to inform those decisions. And decisions are dead easy when the evidence is really clear. And in a sense, that was the starting point of the philosophy of the recovery trial, where, I mean, Lindsay said we didn't know what the outcome should be. Right at that point, in that one particular context, it was pretty obvious. A quarter to a third of people going into hospital didn't make it out alive. So that was the thing that stuck in my head. And therefore, if we could do something about that, then we would have made a big difference. There are other questions, and that people have touched on lots of those. And obviously things evolve over time. But we have to then work out, how do we get a system that generates evidence that makes it easy? And we need to identify the barriers to that, but also we need to make sure that the interactions with, whether it's regulators or funders or other parts of the health system, are not two people sitting at either side, or two groups sitting at either side of a big table, but multiple groups sitting around a common table, trying to actually understand, how do we make things happen? And a lot of the success of recovery when it worked well was in making sure that everybody had a shared objective. We need better information. And the value of that became clear cut. Yes, the moment we announced the results for hydroxychloroquine, use of hydroxychloroquine around the world plummeted. Yes, it took 3 hours to go from announcing the results of dexamethasone to it being NHS hospital policy in every single hospital in the country, saving 1 million lives or more subsequently around the world. But also, people have made differentiations between, regulatory trials or novel products or whatever. I would say there are some very risky practices with regards to licensed products, particularly being repurposed. Convalescent plasma, hydroxychloroquine are examples, but there are many others. There are also much risk in not using some treatments which turn out to be useful. And sometimes those risks are not the same as the risks of whether this is a novel product or not. So just to illustrate, Recovery Trial, yes, produced the results for dexamethasone, been around for decades, but it also produced the results for tocilizumab, which has been around for perhaps a decade or so, and is used is an interleukin-6 antagonist. It alters cytokine, and that was then licensed by 35 regulators, including the FDA, on the basis of exactly those data. So large, simple trial leads to regulatory change. And yes, the Recovery Trial also took the Regeneron's monoclonal antibody, an entirely novel drug, and demonstrated the efficacy of that in a particular group of patients, and that had changed practice around the world. So let's not put in place, this is a bucket for public health, or this is a bucket for licensed drugs, or this is a bucket for a certain group of people or a certain condition. Let's put in place a set of principles which will allow us the one unifying purpose, which is actually to generate the evidence that actually improves health, and generate the standard of evidence that will actually make decision-making easy to do. That's the mission. Any obstacle to that, actually, we need to be very, very wary of. And likewise, I would urge us all to be very wary of using our own favorite jargon. People have used the jargon of decentralized, people have used the jargon of pragmatic, people sometimes use, to me, the jargon of adaptive or platform. It's all jargon. Think of it as a real-world problem, because it is a real-world problem, and think about how you would approach it if you'd never approached medicine or healthcare before. How would you approach it if you were an engineer and coming to look at this system and working out what would you need to put in place to make that happen? We need a complete change of mindset in order to have the transformation. We can do that now for managing hypertension or obesity or mental health. We can do that then in the future for a resurgence of this pandemic or for the next one.
Great thoughts. Okay, Lindsay and Rob, really quickly, and then I want to hit very quickly on a couple of other topics. Lindsay, please go ahead.
Fine. I just want to bring 2 more points onto the floor. One is, as Martin's saying, we're doing trials to improve health. We have to remember, when we don't know the answer, it's possible the therapeutic agent will have benefit, will be neutral, or cause harm. So we have to make sure that safety is woven in a way that's appropriate for the risk and able to be communicated in a way that grows trust, doesn't undermine trust. And we cannot think that everything we do will only have benefit. And we have to manage that uncertainty. I have a lot of respect for the biology. Many of the things we did in the last 3 years looked easy. They were not, they were full of risk, and they may well have turned out differently. In fact, some of our agents that we use to treat COVID, it depends when in COVID you deploy the agent. Early after infection, late after infection. So we may well get our trials wrong if we are too quick to think we know how to do it. So we have to have a lot of respect for the biology, particularly the biology that we may not understand because it's an evolving event. And we have to have the flexibility to adjust our approach to answering the questions.
Great point. Okay, Rob, last word.
Try to do 3 quick points. I know you want to move on. So number one, I think there's really something to this issue of why is it that so many of the things that are so important and identified over and over don't get the funding in the building of infrastructure and the simplification. And I hope we'll come back to that, because it's not that hard to see where the need is, and yet the funding always seems to go to something else. Number 2, I just want to note on this that I think the failure in the US to recognize that mortality is not a hard endpoint to measure, And the fact that we didn't take it on in a country of 330 million people was a major failing of the effort. And so I'm not sure what governance system would have fixed that, but and it's related to point number 3 I made, which as usual with Martin, you know, his Oxford nature brings up my need to disagree with him on things. So I'll just say, while jargon can be talked about, we need common definitions so that when we do use words, they mean the same thing to the same people. And this business on the small trials, I've heard a little bit of pushback, which I completely agree with. There are small good trials, but if you actually look at the analysis of clinicaltrials.gov, whether it was during the pandemic or during normal times, a huge number of small trials are small crappy trials. They couldn't have possibly answered the question. They weren't designed to complete, they didn't finish, and they're not published. It's an enormous waste of money that could go to these issues that came up in point number 1, which is clear deficits in community engagement and support of infrastructure that's simplified and will work. It's just not supported by our financial engines.
Yeah, those are great points. Just one thought on funding, which is kind of adjacent to what you were saying. There's not time to comment on everything you guys were saying, but funding is a complex piece of this. One thing that I think we're all thinking about is how to look at places where the government is already, where funding streams are already going out for various purposes, whether it's research, reimbursement, whatever it is, and think about how that plays into this. You know, for example, if those streams of funding are in place, does that mean that institutions should maybe be, you know, in a place of readiness to participate in certain kinds of research, all the way to, if you have a disaster like a weather disaster and the government needs to intervene there, do you have a window of opportunity in a community to educate and maybe create space for further public health awareness, or maybe even, you know, data collection down the line? But in the few minutes that we've got left here, I want to touch quickly on 2 other issues that are a little bit more specific. One has to do with the concept of an emergency master agreement, which we talked about in the RFI and have had some other discussions about. And the concept here is when you get down to brass tacks and you need to get a bunch of sites working together on a study, and I know that many of you on this panel have had the experience of having to do that, there are certain terms that wind up in dispute and causing delay about, you know, often about data sharing, IRB, other things like that. And so the concept is, would it be useful to have some kind of a framework, call it an emergency master agreement or call it what you will, which could be agreed to in advance by some critical mass of sites or institutions that would cover things like, yes, we agree that the data gathered in this study can be used, you know, beyond our institution. We'll consent people accordingly. We agree to use a central IRB, things of that nature. You could imagine other types of provisions that might be useful to work out in advance for trials that are more complex. Any thoughts on whether that's a good idea, how it might work, what some of the key terms would be, where some of the pain points are when it comes time to work out these agreements? Any thoughts on that? And if nobody's jumping in, Stacey, maybe I'll start with you.
I have a feeling that might end up getting kicked my way. So first and foremost, yes, I think that this is a completely valid approach that should be explored on the idea of trying to establish these master agreements. And I do think that there's been a good point that you and others have raised in regards to trying to establish these is, and it goes to the idea of the infrastructure that we've been talking about for quite some time. We will have to have an acknowledgement that not every site is going to be equipped to do every trial that may wish to be out there. But I think people forget, we refer quite a bit to the interventional trials, which obviously are in the middle of a pandemic, probably some of the most impactful, but there are still observational studies and sort of tracking, tracing, monitoring studies that could be part of this, you know, the ability to just track where the variants are moving, things that are kind of more in the purview of CDC and that. But if we look at this as a huge sort of overarching response and that all of these things can sort of fit together, I do think that there's an ability to have a tiered master agreement where sites can sign on for what they believe the level of it is that they can do. And this will allow us to know the sites that are ready, willing, and able to participate. And even if they can't participate at, an interventional trial level right now, if they begin at the beginning, we have a chance to then work to actually build capacity within them. And because we know they have an interest in participating in trials, we know that they've got at least baseline resources and staff to do so. And so I think this is a good way to sort of just put us on the right path. And again, things that are going to be stumbling points, obviously, in these, at least here in the US and, maybe somewhat abroad. Data sharing is an issue. I think we've noted this a couple of times that somewhat here in the US, it's a matter of formatting and structure and making sure that everybody can share the data across the various systems that are currently in existence. As you go internationally, it starts to play into more, privacy and data rules. EU, it's GDPR, other places, it's other requirements. And so, I think if we're looking at this in a global response, there's a lot of coordination that's going to have to happen. And then, I think there will be other things, just the ability, I think, reassurance that there's going to be support and funding that comes behind this, and making people understand that just because they're signing on to the master agreement, they're not obligated to actually conduct the trials. This is just their lawyers are pre-agreeing to terms.
Agree. Great points. Okay, so Esther and Brian, real quick, and then I want to save the last couple of minutes to raise some questions about international. Esther, please go ahead.
Yes, just quickly, I hate to remind us all, but we have to remember that the agreements that were put in place happened very quickly during COVID because of the emergency nature of COVID, right? In normal time, it takes many years, multiple lawyers to get to agreement. So I just have to set the realistic nature of how these agreements and contracts are put in place. That being said, I just want to point us quickly to an example with NCATS. With their CTSA programs, we're able to put together an agreement where those 53 institutions that participate in the CTSA programs, the Clinical Translational Service Award Program, actually came together in a common platform to share data in a way that had never happened before, to ask questions relevant for COVID-19. You can think about how that could be repurposed for other questions, but again, it's very specific for COVID. And it took the emergency in order for us to put that in place. So don't want to underestimate the effort in order to do so. And another quick example, in the COVID, it took the VA 18 months to have an interagency agreement. So we need to overcome some of these challenges as well.
Great points, Brian, real quick.
Yeah, just a few quick points. So just to echo what Esther said, I think the CTSA example was fantastic with NCATS, and it points to, I think, the need, bringing up one of the points Martin made earlier, the need to have a common agreement for the infrastructure ahead of time, with a data model set that would be easily deployable across those health systems, I think is going to be really critical. We also found central IRBs to be enormously helpful in standing up and activating sites, and then for the duration of the trial. And then I forget who brought it up, but the really important point is we also encountered health systems that felt really comfortable with doing interventional trials versus others that really felt that they were more apt for observational trials or studies only. And so I think having the kinds of master agreements that allow for that kind of flexibility, I think will be really important charting a path forward.
Yeah, agree, and great points. And Stacey had briefly mentioned GDPR. I know that's one of the big challenges internationally. I don't know if we just have 1 minute left. If anybody wants to add anything on that particular point or on the challenges of adding sites internationally. Perhaps that's a topic we should pick up at another time. It's another huge topic unto itself. Let's go to some of the questions in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Grail. This conversation continues to be incredible, and thank you again for everyone who's putting comments into the chat. I'm doing my best to pull out themes to make sure we're really capturing the essence of it. And something that has been really thematic throughout this has been the importance of workforce. And I think one way to think a little bit upstream in terms of rebuilding trust, both in clinical medicine, but importantly in clinical research, is rethinking our workforce. And I want to put it out to the panel. How can we potentially rethink both how we credential, train, and recruit research staff so that our teams represent better the patients that we're recruiting. Lauren.
Just on that, what's special be about being research staff versus being a doctor? I mean, doctors are responsible for prescribing, they're responsible for making diagnosis, they're responsible for making accurate records, they're responsible for whistleblowing should there be a particular health or safety issue for a particular patient, etc., etc., etc. There are some things that are special, but they actually often vary protocol by protocol or in context. Let's not create layers and layers of additional training, which it automatically creates a barrier between those who can do trials and those who can't. Let's instead build on what's there. It's part of this, what's so special about doing trials? I'm a sort of professor of trials, so I think trials are special. But I want to actually flip that round and say, actually, what's so different about the fact that you're doing a trial? And does it need to be? And if that's a regulatory or a legal or an IRB or a policy decision or a funding decision that's actually driving that practice, let's not be shy about going back to those and unpicking that to see whether that's really necessary versus not. So I'm not arguing against no training at all. I'm not arguing against upskilling people. But what I am saying is, don't think that trials are magically so different to the rest of life that only those with some special piece of paper are the people who can do it. Let's think about it in a much more enabling way. We did actually, in the recovery protocol, and agreed with MHRA, the regulation in the UK, actually make it quite clear that substantial elements of the clinical trial could be done by, for example, by people who weren't medically qualified. It depends what their role is, but let's make sure that we can actually get more people, give more clinicians and healthcare staff the opportunity to contribute to trials. And that will help with that diversity and inclusivity piece, because there's nobody like the local doctor, the local pharmacist, the local nurse who knows their patient population better than that local person. So let's empower them rather than put barriers in the way.
Sure, that's a fantastic point, but I'm going to challenge us just for a moment to think beyond the clinicians and to think beyond the research nurses. It's also about the research assistants, and it's about the coordinators, and it's about the people who are the face of our trials. And that's also
that's what I'm arguing is, why are those people? I mean, sometimes you need those people, but actually, if the difference between prescribing convalescent plasma and which is entirely an experiment from which you learn nothing, and you expose the patient to risk and unknown knowledge about whether there's benefit or not, what's the trigger point between that and actually randomizing them to whether they get convalescent plasma or not? That's a clinical decision which is made by a doctor and is administered by a nurse, and the reactions to the infusion are recorded by a healthcare assistant or by a nurse or whatever. Let's make it easy. Let's not make it hard.
Sure. Ramita.
Yeah, I would just add to Martin's, from the retail pharmacy perspective, as we look to enable our clinical pharmacists and our pharmacy techs, obviously we're trying to train them on all the trial, regulations, et cetera. For us, it's important, since they are front and center with their patients and the communities they serve, we want to be able to enable them and expand the role of the retail pharmacy and the infrastructure and the role of the pharmacist to do more in clinical trials and to have more of a prominent role versus perhaps a subordinate role that they're having today and that they're playing. So we're looking at it from our perspective, not just the pharmacists, but the pharmacy techs and all the pharmacy care teams that are having the daily interactions with their patients that come into our stores and pharmacies.
Excellent point. Rob.
In my ongoing quibble with Martin, I want to make 2 points. I guess they sort of joined together by the quibble about jargon versus terminology. I mean, the first is that I think what you're really trying to raise, as I take it, is we have to have intentionality about inclusivity of the research staff. For better or actually for worse, in the US, if we said it's doctors, there would be a lot of things left out, including the fact that doctors in the US are not representative of the population in terms of other demographic characteristics. So intentionality and trying to deal with that is important. But the other thing I think is really, really critical, and it's a place where FDA has a major thing to straighten out. If we say that the default for being a qualified clinical trial person is that you can do a phase 1 highly complex new molecule clinical trial with all the things that you have to know to do that, we're making a big mistake. We need to identify the group of trials that are practical, whatever the right word is, Martin. I think people know that between NIH and FDA, we're now trying to come up with a terminology that can straighten some of this out. But for the kind of trials that Recovery did, you clearly don't need to be the kind of person who would be administering a drug on a clock to multiple people and recording 1,000 items in a short period of time. So matching the training and the inclusion to the type of trial is really important, I think.
Gail, if I may, oh, sorry, can I just come back to Rob? We're agreeing on the jargon issue, I think, or the terminology issue within the shop. I think it might have even learned the term from Lindsay, inside baseball. Then we need the terminology in order to make sure that each of us knows exactly what we're talking about. It's like medicine. You need complex diagnostic terms like, you know, PCI to the left anterior descending coronary artery, in order that one cardiologist can talk precisely to another cardiologist. When one thinks about the problem in the broader context, then we need to be careful to try and think about this in what I'd call plain English, which I realise is a phrase. But when one thinks about this in a way that the broader public can understand, and I don't just mean the public as in, you know, patient public. I mean, you know, the political public, the journalist public, actually, you know, much more broadly. We're all part of that public. So my quibble on jargon is not that we shouldn't have terminology. We should actually understand what we mean by terminology, but that we should actually articulate this in a way that, you know, it's the equivalent of the lay summary, if you like. So it's just that. But I mean, Rob and I are agreeing, you know, I think rather rampantly.
It's no fun if we agree. We have to disagree on some things.
Lisa, please.
Diversifying teams, clinical trial teams, requires ensuring people know that this is actually a career path. So we have not done a great job of helping people understand that there's an opportunity for them. So how can we fix that? But I also think, even though we don't want to exclusively talk about clinicians, we have a long way to go to even help clinicians, especially clinicians on the front line, understand what their role is in diversifying clinical trials or enrolling their patients in trials, finding trials. So the support isn't there for primary care providers and their teams on the front line to do this. And the last thing I'll say is, having tried this with primary care providers at an infectious disease clinic I was running in an underserved neighborhood, some of the concerns around participating in trials for primary care providers was that they might lose their patient, which cuts into revenue. And so these are other issues that also need to be part of this conversation. How do we continue to make the providers and their teams whole if the person has to go off to an academic center rather than have the ability to participate at a community-based site?
Fantastic point. Well, we're coming up on time, so I'm going to wrap it there unless there's any final comments on this topic or things that have been left unsaid from our panelists. But I might ask my colleagues to put back up the slide with the link to the request for information. And I'm going to do a final call to everyone who's participated today. You put just incredible thoughts in the chat, and I really welcome and encourage you to take an opportunity to respond formally via the request for information. Again, this can be as simple as an email. You can respond to one component of it, you can respond to all of it. And we really welcome your diverse opinion, even if you think it's nuanced. It helps us really capture the complexity of the issue at hand. So with that, no final comments from the panelists. I'm going to turn it back to Grail to close us out, but huge thanks from OSTP for participating in this. Huge thanks for our panelists.
Yes, huge thanks. And Lizzie, you should feel free to chime in as well. This has been a fantastic discussion, and I think it really illustrated how all the different topics that we need to discuss really overlay each other. You know, we can't have a readiness to conduct trials in an emergency unless we have better systems, resources, and training in place beforehand. Solving the challenges of equity and diversity is a multifaceted problem. I come back to the mismatch comment that Esther made and others along those lines, which actually kind of harmonizes with a lot of what Martin was saying, trying to figure out how to align the goals of research with the goals of care, and not think of those as two completely and utterly separate things. This has a lot of implications for the systems that we use as well, and for how we push out protocols and capture data, which is a whole other dimension of this. We had some great thoughts about protocols and about how those should be designed, what the range is that you might encounter in an emergency, and how that affects different potential situations. And all in all, there's a huge amount here to think about. We really look forward to carrying this project forward. We are going to be actively looking at everything, and already have been looking at what we've gotten so far in the comments on both of these RFIs. We'll be looking further at that, going back and looking closely at the transcript from this event and yesterday's, and all the other input that we get. As we move forward with this effort, we'll be thinking about what kinds of commitments and actions in this space might help us move closer to a better state, both in terms of being prepared to carry out clinical trials in an emergency, and strengthening an infrastructure that will improve the way we deliver care in our communities, which is kind of a very urgent parallel need. And with that, Lizzie, unless you have anything to add, I think that we can wrap it up.
Thank you, everyone, for a tremendous event.